Hi, I'm Mike Lee, author of Our Lost Constitution. At the close of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the elderly Benjamin Franklin hobbled out of the lengthy debates that had been held in what we now call Independence Hall, what was then called the State House of Pennsylvania. And someone asked the elderly statesman, what have we got, doctor? What have you wrought? A republic or a monarchy? And he famously responded, at the conclusion of this, the hottest summer that Philadelphia had seen in 37 years, he said, a republic, if you can keep it. The bystander's question was a fair one at the time it was asked, especially given that in 1787, republics were not necessarily the norm. In fact, in what we would have thought of as our peer nations at the time, the monarchy was still the norm. I mean, look, King Louis XVI was still enjoying his reign in France. King Carlos IV ruled in Spain. Queen Maria wore the crown in Portugal, and King Friedrich Wilhelm III wore the crown in Prussia. And, this was all over the world, certainly all over Europe. It also included Shogun Ieyasu in Japan, and it included so many other monarchs, indicating that this really was an age of monarchy. We were the exception, not the rule. And of course, meanwhile, King George III still sat on his throne in London. The revolution was over. King George III was still really mad and still wasn't entirely willing to give up on the fact that he had lost that war, as we would see with the War of 1812. But he was not yet halfway through what would become his 6 decades on the throne as the King of England. And so it was by no means a foregone conclusion that we would end up with a republic. This was an unusual thing at the time. And yet, fortunately for all of us, it's exactly what we got. Because here in America, what had been American colonists, still British subjects prior to the Revolution, but American colonists had enjoyed a degree of self-rule. They had been allowed to govern themselves through colonial legislatures and more local legislative bodies. For the most part, Great Britain had allowed the colonists a pretty wide degree of latitude. It's one of the things that sowed the seeds for what became the American Revolution, was that for a long time we were allowed to govern ourselves. And this worked well here. Well, there were those here in the American colonies, even at the time of the Revolution and even after the Revolution, who were patriots in and of themselves, who loved this country, who loved the fact that we were no longer subject to Great Britain, who still clung to this idea that we ought to have a king. And in fact, one of them was one of our most famous founding fathers, a founding father who is perhaps rapidly becoming the most famous founding father right now, and that's Alexander Hamilton. The reason I say he's rapidly becoming arguably the most famous founding father is simply that when you look at it from the standpoint of popular culture, when you look at what has happened with the Broadway musical Hamilton, named after Alexander Hamilton, and focusing on his life and on his contribution to our history, he has rapidly become well known in American pop culture, and I think that's a great thing. It's indicative of the fact that the American people instinctively revere the founding fathers, and they really want to have some connection to our Revolution era and founding era that they can grab onto. And Alexander Hamilton certainly was an interesting individual. But as I explained in Chapter 3 of Our Lost Constitution, Alexander Hamilton had some ideas that many of us would find appalling today. Fortunately, they were not adopted by the founding fathers. But Alexander Hamilton was an interesting character. He was born in the Caribbean, and he became an orphan at a very young age. And perhaps in part because of the way he was raised and in part because of some of his early life experiences, he was particularly drawn toward father figures. George Washington became a close father figure, and that's depicted quite well in the Broadway musical Hamilton. And I think some of that influenced his desire to have a monarch. I tell a story in Chapter 3 of our Lost Constitution about a time when he stood up for Miles Cooper, who was the president of his college, King's College, which later became Columbia University. Miles Cooper was no friend of Alexander Hamilton's, nor was the reverse true. In fact, Miles Cooper was a Tory. He was loyal to the British Crown at the time of the Revolution. But I tell a story about how Alexander Hamilton jumped to his aid, notwithstanding the fact that he was being attacked by American patriots, people who supported the revolution, simply because Alexander Hamilton feared the mob. And that fear of the mob was carried with him even to the Constitutional Convention. So much so that when Alexander Hamilton got to the Constitutional Convention, he actually proposed that we have a monarchy, that we choose a monarch, someone who would serve as our chief executive for life. He just thought this was the best way of doing things, that this was a good system of government. One can read into this, and especially when one reads into his speech that he gave at the Constitutional Convention, that he feared that without a monarch, without a father figure for the entire country, the type of father figure that he had so craved but lacked as a child. He was before he became orphaned, he had been abandoned. He and his mother and his siblings had been abandoned by his father, and then of course his mother died. But he wanted a father figure not only for himself but also for the country. And I think this is one of the reasons why he proposed this. He just didn't trust the people to avoid the consequences of mob rule. So he ended up making this proposal at the Constitutional Convention. Now, to be clear, this was not a lighthearted proposal. This was not something that he just said, hey, maybe we ought to consider doing this. Rather, this was a major, major emphasis. I mean, he spoke for 6 hours at a time on one particular occasion, advocating aggressively for a monarch. So why is this story important to us today? Why is it relevant now? Well, it is for the simple reason that it was rejected. We've got to remember that it was rejected and why it was rejected. It was rejected because we wanted a monarch. We did not want a monarchy. We wanted a republic. The advantage of a republic over a monarchy is, of course, the fact that the government remains at all times under a republic, under the control of the people. Its operation is delegated for limited times and defined purposes to the people's elected representatives, but it's never just handed over to someone in perpetuity or to any one group of people. The people making law, setting policy that will be affecting the citizenry, always remains under the control, in one way or another, of the voters, of the American citizens. This is a really important point to remember, and it's one that often goes neglected. In fact, it's one that has itself been weakened in modern times as we have shifted more and more of our policy-making power, more and more of our law-making authority over to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Now, I want to be very clear. There is a distinction between an unelected, unaccountable federal bureaucrat on the one hand and a king like under King George III on the other. There's a huge difference. Nevertheless, many of the same things that people don't like about a despot, about having a system of government in which someone can't be fired, someone can subject his or her will on the people, potentially to the great detriment of the people, particularly those people who are not friendly with the king. A lot of those same risks are themselves presented by our modern regulatory system that we have adopted through the federal government. Let me explain what I mean by this. What I discuss in Chapter 3, introduced by these stories about Alexander Hamilton, is a phenomenon whereby Congress has delegated a lot of its lawmaking power. It's very important, as I point out in Chapter 3, that the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution is dedicated to this issue, is dedicated to providing that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. That makes clear that you cannot make a law in this country. You cannot establish federal policy in this country without going through Congress. Congress has to make the law because all legislative powers herein granted are vested in that Congress. That means if you want to make a law, it has to go through Congress, and it has to follow the formula outlined in Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, namely, before something becomes law, an idea that wants to become a law can become a law. It has to be passed by the House of Representatives, it has to be passed by the Senate in the same form, and it has to be signed into law by the President, or at least acquiesced to, meaning not producing a veto on the part of the President. Without that formula, you're not supposed to make law. Not federal law. But to make federal law, you have to do it this way. You have to follow this formula. Sadly, we've departed from this. Congress, since the 1930s, has undertaken a practice of basically saying we're going to outsource a lot of this lawmaking power. So a lot of tasks, a lot of important tasks, like, for example, clean air. Clean air, it's easy to understand why this is a federal priority because air travels from one state to another, and is part of our interstate system of airways, airwaves, waterways, and so forth. And it includes air that moves from one state to another. It's part of the flow of interstate commerce, if you will. This is an appropriate federal responsibility. It's appropriate for Congress to address. But in some instances, Congress has addressed the clean air issue more or less as follows, basically by saying, we shall have clean air. And by the way, we hereby delegate to the EPA the task of defining what clean air is, the task of deciding what pollution is, the task of deciding what are appropriate limits on pollution, how much any polluter may emit, and what the consequences for polluting are. And then the same people who make those laws get to enforce them. In this respect, Congress outsources the task of making law. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of good has been accomplished under the Clean Air Act, and it's a good thing that we have cleaner air today than we did several decades ago when this was first adopted. But the way Congress went about it has caused some other problems, and this is by no means limited to EPA or the task of clean air. This has replicated itself since the 1930s in almost every aspect of government, to where Congress says, we want good law in area X, and we hereby delegate to federal agency Y the task of making law in that area and enforcing that law. This violates several constitutional commands. One is Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, that says all legislative power shall be vested in a Congress. Another is the very concept of separation of powers that is at the core of the Constitution, was strongly influenced by the political philosophers who most strongly influenced the Founding Fathers, including Charles de Montesquieu, who had explained that you can't fuse the law-making power with the law enforcement power, because if you do that, anyone or any group willing to make tyrannical laws will also enforce them tyrannically. And if you fuse the law enforcement power with the lawmaking power, bad things always happen. So that's why the Constitution was set up the way it was. It's one of the reasons why we ought to be concerned that so many of our laws are now passed by federal bureaucrats. Because you can't vote for federal bureaucrats. You can't vote them into office. You can't vote them out of office. In fact, I keep in my office in Washington these two stacks of documents to remind me of how significant this problem is. One stack is a few inches tall. It's a few hundred pages long. And it consists of the laws passed by Congress last year. The other stack is 80,000 pages long. It's 11 feet tall, and it consists of last year's Federal Register. For those of you fortunate enough not to know what the Federal Register is, it's the annual cumulative index of federal regulations as they're proposed and then finalized as they take effect. So by volume, and in many respects by economic impact, the laws put in place by federal regulators, who can neither be hired nor fired by the American people, are making a disproportionate share of federal law. This is resulting in all kinds of problems. I mean, we actually asked a few years ago some experts within the federal government, the Congressional Research Service, if they could help tell us how many federal criminal offenses are on the books. They could not tell us. They concluded that it's unknown and virtually unknowable, but that there are probably at least 300,000 separate provisions of federal law pursuant to which someone might commit a crime. Now, many of these are made criminal offenses by some type of regulatory action. This is why you sometimes hear about the couple up in Idaho, for example. They'd gotten a building permit. They were starting to dig a foundation for their home. They had cleared some brush out of the area, and they were getting ready to build a house when they ended up being informed by the EPA that, unbeknownst to them or anyone else, that they were building on a wetland. And they had to choose between paying these mounting civil monetary penalties of, I think, about $25,000 or $30,000 a day, or alternatively just settling with the government. I tell the story in my book about a father and son who ended up doing prison time under similar circumstances, all because of a regulatory determination that a particular piece of property amounted to a wetland, and therefore these people were deemed in violation of federal regulations regarding wetlands, for which there were criminal penalties. These are real problems. It's also a problem when EPA, for example, will set limits for a particular pollutant, say ozone, at levels below the naturally occurring ozone level. That's the case in parts of my home state of Utah. There are places where the current EPA regulations set ozone limits at levels below the naturally occurring ambient ozone levels. Now, what I'm saying here is that it's a real big problem whenever you entrust federal policy-making power, when you entrust someone to set federal policy backed by the overwhelming, overpowering force of the federal government, without making sure that that policy is set by people who are elected and accountable to the people. It's not that members of Congress are any smarter, any brighter, or anything else than federal bureaucrats. In fact, in many ways, you can make the case that there's no one in their respective fields more well-educated, hard-working, specialized, well-intentioned than our federal regulators. But that isn't the point. The point is, the reason our Constitution entrusts the lawmaking power only to elected senators and representatives is because we work for the people. We can be fired by the people. Senators like me can be fired every 6 years. Representatives can be fired every 2 years. And if we make laws that are bad for you and for our other constituents, then you can fire us. And that's really the way it needs to work. But as it stands right now, when somebody is harmed by an executive branch regulation, very often what happens is citizens will come to their members of Congress and they'll say, this is horrible. And their member of Congress will beat their chest and say, oh, you're right, oh, those barbarians at EPA or OSHA or whatever other alphabet soup agency, they're awful, aren't they? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write them a harshly worded letter. But, you know, it's our job to make the laws. And we should be accountable for making the laws. We shouldn't just beat our chest and say we're going to write a letter to a federal agency. And that's one of the many reasons why we need reform in this area. This whole system, this whole federal regulatory system as we now know it, was set up in part by a Harvard law professor named James Landis back in the 1930s. He was a member of FDR's brain trust. James Landis advised President Roosevelt at the time that as a matter of following good form, federal regulations ought not take effect insofar as they have impose significant obligations on the American public without them first going through Congress. They ought to be passed into law formally by Congress before they take effect. For whatever reason, FDR didn't follow this advice, and the advice was then neglected over the period of many decades. For a long time, Congress kept one foot on the door by saying, if we don't like a federal regulation, once it takes effect, then we can invalidate it. A one-house legislative veto, or in some cases a two-house legislative veto. These became very powerful because they allowed Congress to undo bad federal regulations. Those were widely used. In fact, there were hundreds of those legislative veto provisions on the books until the mid-1980s, when the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case called INS v. Chadha, in which the Supreme Court concluded that these legislative veto provisions violated the presentment clause of Article 1, Section 7. A lot of people assumed that after INS v. Chadha, there would no longer be an opportunity for massive delegation, because after all, members of Congress wouldn't want to delegate away power if they could no longer control where that power was used. But alas, that didn't happen. What happened instead was that Congress got worse. Congress started delegating legislative power more rather than less, for the simple reason that it becomes easier for members of Congress to avoid criticism, which is what members of Congress really like to do, because it helps them get reelected more easily. It would help members of Congress avoid criticism and get more praise for doing good things, and when bad things were done with federal power, they could easily disclaim any credit. Fortunately, there is a fix. I discussed this in my book, Our Lost Constitution. One of there are a number of legislative reforms that are needed. Top on that list, I would say, is a proposal called the Reins Act. It's an acronym, REINS, stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. It says that any time a federal executive branch agency adopts a provision of law, a new regulation carrying the force of generally applicable law, and one that would have a significant economic impact, it may not take effect unless or until both houses of Congress, both the House and the Senate, have passed it into law, and the President has signed it into law. This would put Congress back in the seat of being accountable. This would make it so that members of Congress could once again be held accountable for what goes on in the federal government. Right now, there's too much easy deniability because we can just delegate the task of lawmaking to somebody else. So I'd encourage you to take a look at Our Lost Constitution, take a look at my explanation of the Legislative Powers Clause, of the Reins Act, and the other provisions of the Constitution. If you haven't read it yet, pick up a copy. You can borrow a copy from a friend. You can check it out from a library. If worse comes to worse, you can even buy a copy of it. It's still available on Amazon and I think at Barnes & Noble. There's even a link to a place where you can buy Our Lost Constitution through the Our Lost Constitution Facebook page. And I'd also encourage you, if you like these videos, if you'd like to see more of them, please like this page and follow it and share it with your friends and encourage them to do the same so that they can become part of this discussion also. Thank you very much for joining me. May God bless the United States of America.